The winter wind cut through Penelope's thin shawl like 1,000 knives as she stood at the locked door, her knuckles raw from knocking, knowing that no one would answer. She had married Thomas Lawrence 3 months ago, and every night since the first snow fell, her mother-in-law had made it clear that Penelope was not welcome inside after sunset. The older woman's hatred burned hotter than any hearth fire, and tonight, like all the others, Penelope would have to find shelter somewhere in the freezing darkness of San Jose, California, in the winter of 1878. Her breath formed white clouds in the air as she turned away from the modest house on the edge of town. Thomas worked the mines up north and would not return for another 2 weeks. She had written him letters, but they remained unanswered, and she wondered if his mother had intercepted them before they could reach the post. Her feet crunched through the frost-covered grass as she made her way down the dirt road, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The temperature had dropped significantly since the sun had set, and she knew she needed to find warmth soon or risk freezing to death. She had spent the previous nights huddled in various places around town, always careful not to be seen. The general store's back porch had offered some protection one night, and another time she had squeezed into the space beneath the church steps. But tonight, those places felt too exposed, and she needed something better. Her teeth chattered as she walked, her thin boots doing little to protect her feet from the cold ground. The town was quiet at this hour, most families already settled in for the evening meal. Penelope could see warm lamplight glowing from windows as she passed, and the scent of cooking food made her stomach clench with hunger. Her mother-in-law had given her no supper before locking her out, just as she had done every night. The woman took pleasure in Penelope's suffering, blaming her for taking away her son, even though Thomas had been the one to pursue the courtship. Penelope had been a seamstress in town, living with her aunt after her parents died of fever 2 years earlier. Thomas had seemed kind when he courted her, bringing her wildflowers and speaking of building a life together. He had not mentioned that his mother was a cruel woman who would rather see Penelope dead than sharing her home. The marriage had been quick, and Thomas had left for the mines shortly after, leaving Penelope alone with a woman who despised her. As she walked further from town, she spotted a large barn in the distance. It sat on the property of a ranch she had heard about but never visited. The Northwood Ranch was owned by a cowboy named Grant Northwood, a man she had seen only once or twice in town. He kept to himself mostly, focusing on his cattle and horses. The barn looked sturdy and large enough that she might find a hidden corner where she could rest without being discovered. Penelope approached cautiously, her eyes scanning the darkened windows of the ranch house beyond the barn. No light shone from within, and she wondered if the owner was away or simply asleep. She reached the barn door and found it unlatched, a small blessing in this terrible night. Slipping inside, she was immediately grateful for the shelter from the wind. The air inside was warmer, heated by the body warmth of the animals housed within. She could hear horses shifting in their stalls and the soft lowing of cattle. The smell of hay and livestock filled her nostrils, a far cry from the lavender sachets she used to keep in her sewing basket, but she was in no position to be particular. Her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she spotted a ladder leading up to a hayloft. Climbing carefully, she found a pile of fresh hay that would make a decent bed for the night. Penelope burrowed into the hay, pulling it around herself like a blanket. It prickled through her dress, but it was better than freezing outside. She curled into a tight ball, trying to preserve what little body heat she had left. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she thought about how her life had changed so drastically. She had imagined marriage would bring her security and happiness, but instead, it had brought her to this lowest point. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by shivers and the sounds of the animals below. She dreamed of her parents, of the warm home they had kept before the fever took them. In her dream, her mother was braiding her hair and singing softly, and her father was laughing at something from his chair by the fire. When she woke, the loss hit her anew, and she had to bite her lip to keep from sobbing aloud. The first light of dawn was filtering through the cracks in the barn walls when she heard the barn door creak open below. Penelope froze, pressing herself deeper into the hay, hoping whoever had entered would not climb up to the loft. Heavy footsteps moved across the barn floor, and she heard the sound of grain being poured into feeding troughs. The horses whinnied softly, greeting their caretaker. Grant Northwood had risen early as he always did, ready to tend to his animals before the day fully began. He was a tall man of 26 years, with dark hair and eyes the color of weathered wood. He had inherited the ranch from his father 5 years ago and had worked hard to build it into something profitable. The life was solitary, but he preferred it that way after watching his father drink himself to death following his mother's passing. He moved through his morning routine with practiced efficiency, checking each horse and making sure the cattle had enough feed. As he reached for a pitchfork to clean out one of the stalls, something caught his eye in the loft above. A piece of blue fabric, the color of a woman's dress, was visible among the hay. He set down the pitchfork and climbed the ladder quietly, unsure what he would find. When he reached the top, he saw her. A young woman was curled up in his hay, sleeping fitfully despite the growing daylight. Her face was pale, and even in sleep she looked troubled. Her clothes were thin and inadequate for the winter weather, and he could see that she was shivering despite being surrounded by hay. For a moment, he simply stared, trying to understand why a woman would be sleeping in his barn. Grant cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle her too badly. Penelope's eyes flew open, and she scrambled backward, fear written clearly across her face. Her heart pounded as she looked at the tall cowboy standing at the top of the ladder, blocking her only escape route. "I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice hoarse from the cold. "I did not mean to trespass. I was just so cold and I needed somewhere to stay. I will leave right now." She tried to stand, but her legs were stiff from the cold and from sleeping in such an awkward position. She stumbled, and Grant reached out instinctively to steady her. His hand was warm and rough from work, and the touch sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the cold. "Hold on," he said, his voice deeper than she expected. "You do not have to leave right this moment, but I would like to know why you were sleeping in my barn in the middle of winter, wearing clothes that would barely keep you warm in spring." Penelope looked down at her feet, shame coloring her cheeks. She did not want to explain her situation to this stranger, did not want him to know how pathetic her life had become. But something in his eyes, a genuine concern rather than judgment, made her want to tell the truth. "My mother-in-law locks me out every night," she said quietly. "My husband is away working the mines, and she refuses to let me stay inside after dark. I've been finding places to sleep around town, and last night I saw your barn. I thought it would be warmer than where I had been staying. I truly am sorry for trespassing." Grant's jaw tightened as he listened. He had heard of cruelty between family members, but this seemed particularly heartless. What kind of woman would lock out her son's wife in the dead of winter? He looked at the young woman before him, really looked at her, and saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the hunger in the hollows of her cheeks. "What is your name?" he asked. "Penelope Lawrence," she replied. "I live with my husband's mother on the east side of town, or rather, I am supposed to live there." "I am Grant Northwood," he said, "and you should not be sleeping in barns in this weather. You could freeze to death." "I have nowhere else to go," Penelope said, her voice breaking slightly. "I have no money of my own, and my husband is not due back for 2 more weeks. His mother gives me no supper and locks the door at sunset. I have tried knocking, tried pleading, but she will not let me in." Grant felt anger rise in his chest at the thought of someone treating another person this way. He had always believed in basic human decency, and this situation violated everything he held right. He made a decision quickly, knowing it might cause talk in town, but not caring. "You will stay here," he said firmly. "Not in the barn, but in the house. I have a spare room that is not being used, and you can stay there until your husband returns. No one should have to sleep in a barn when there's a warm bed available." Penelope stared at him in disbelief. She had expected him to send her away, perhaps even threaten to report her to the sheriff for trespassing. Instead, this stranger was offering her shelter, and she did not know what to say. "I cannot accept," she said finally. "It would not be proper. People would talk, and it might damage your reputation." "My reputation can withstand some gossip," Grant said, "but your health cannot withstand many more nights in the cold. Come inside, have some breakfast, and warm yourself by the fire. We can figure out the rest later." He climbed back down the ladder and waited at the bottom for her. Penelope hesitated for only a moment before following him. Her body ached from the cold and the uncomfortable sleeping position, and the promise of warmth was too tempting to refuse. She climbed down carefully, and when she reached the bottom, Grant was there to steady her again. They walked across the yard to the ranch house, and Penelope felt acutely aware of how she must look with hay in her hair and her dress rumpled and dirty. Grant opened the door and gestured for her to enter. The warmth inside hit her immediately, She almost gasped at how good it felt. A fire burned in the stone fireplace, and the room was furnished simply but comfortably. "Sit by the fire," Grant instructed, pointing to a chair near the hearth. "I will make some coffee and breakfast." Penelope did as she was told, sinking into the chair and holding her hands out toward the flames. Feeling slowly returned to her fingers, accompanied by a painful tingling sensation. She watched as Grant moved around the kitchen area, setting a pot of coffee on the stove and pulling out ingredients for a meal. He moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to caring for himself. "How long has this been going on?" he asked as he worked. "The locking out, I mean." "Since the first snow," Penelope replied. "About 2 weeks now. Before that, she was merely cold toward me, but she let me stay inside. Something changed when winter came. I think she decided I was not worthy of even basic shelter." "What does your husband say about this?" "He does not know. I have written to him, but I suspect his mother has destroyed my letters. He writes to her but never mentions hearing from me. I fear he thinks I have simply stopped writing to him." Grant set a plate of eggs and bread in front of her, along with a cup of hot coffee. The smell alone made Penelope's mouth water, and she realized she had not had a proper meal in days. She ate slowly, trying to maintain some dignity, but her hunger was too great. Grant sat across from her with his own plate and ate in silence for a while. "You can stay here until your husband returns," he said finally. "I will not hear any arguments about propriety. If people talk, let them talk. I have a spare room with a good bed and a door that locks from the inside. You will be safe and warm, and you will have meals. In exchange, if you are willing, you can help with some of the household tasks. I'm not much for cooking beyond the basics, and the house could use a woman's touch." Penelope looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Why are you being so kind to me? You do not know me at all." Grant was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "My mother died when I was young," he said finally. "She got sick, and my father could not afford the medicine she needed. I watched her suffer, and I swore then that if I ever had the means to help someone, I would do it. You need help, and I have the means to provide it. It is as simple as that." "Thank you," Penelope whispered. "I will work hard to earn my keep. I am a skilled seamstress, and I can cook and clean. You will not regret this kindness." "I am sure I will not," Grant said, offering her a small smile. It was the first time she had seen him smile, and it transformed his serious face into something warmer and more approachable. After breakfast, Grant showed her to the spare room. It was small but clean, with a bed covered in quilts, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the ranch. Penelope touched the bed reverently, unable to believe she would be sleeping in such comfort after the nights in the cold. "There is a basin and pitcher for washing," Grant said, pointing to the dresser. "And I will see about getting you some warmer clothes. You cannot continue wearing what you have on. It is not suitable for this weather." "I have other clothes at my mother-in-law's house," Penelope said, "but I do not think she would let me retrieve them." "Then we will find you something else," Grant said firmly. "Rest for now. You look exhausted. I have work to do outside, but I will be back for lunch." He left her alone, and Penelope sat on the edge of the bed trying to process everything that had happened. Just hours ago, she had been sleeping in a cold barn, uncertain if she would survive the night. Now she was in a warm house with a kind man who expected nothing from her, except some help with household tasks. It seemed too good to be true, and she half expected to wake up and find it had all been a dream. But it was not a dream. The bed was real, the warmth was real, and the kindness in Grant's eyes had been real too. Penelope lay back on the bed, intending to rest for just a few minutes, but exhaustion claimed her, and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When she woke, the sun was high in the sky, and she could hear movement in the other room. She rose quickly, feeling guilty for sleeping so long, and smoothed down her dress as best she could. Opening the door, she found Grant sitting at the table, working on what appeared to be account books. "I am sorry," she said. "I did not mean to sleep so long." "You needed the rest," Grant said, looking up from his work. "I brought some things in from town. There's a dress and a coat in a bag by your door. They should fit well enough. Mrs. Chen at the general store helped me pick them out." Penelope felt her cheeks flush. "You did not have to do that. I will repay you as soon as I am able." "Consider it part of your wages," Grant said, returning his attention to his books. If you are going to work here, you need proper clothing for the weather." Penelope retrieved the bag and returned to her room to change. The dress was a simple gray wool, warm and practical, and the coat was lined with flannel. They fit reasonably well, and she felt like a different person when she looked at her reflection in the small mirror above the dresser. She looked less like a desperate, frightened woman and more like someone with dignity and purpose. She spent the rest of the day cleaning the house and preparing a proper dinner. Grant had a well-stocked pantry, and she made a hearty stew with beef and vegetables, along with fresh bread. When Grant came in from his work outside, he stopped in the doorway, surprised by the transformation of his house. "It smells wonderful in here," he said, removing his hat and coat. "I cannot remember the last time this place felt like a real home." They ate dinner together, and Penelope found herself relaxing in Grant's presence. He was quiet but not unkind, and he had a dry sense of humor that made her laugh occasionally. He asked about her life before marriage, and she told him about her parents, about learning to sew from her mother, about the small joys of her life before fever had taken her family. "What about you?" she asked. "You mentioned your mother passed. Do you have any other family?" Grant shook his head. "My father died 5 years ago. It was just him and me after Mother passed. He took her death hard, turned to drink. By the end, he was more ghost than man. I have some cousins back east, but we do not keep in touch." "It must be lonely out here by yourself," Penelope said softly. It is," Grant admitted, "but loneliness is better than the alternative sometimes. I've seen what happens when people stay together out of obligation rather than care. My father resented me for reminding him of my mother. He never said it, but I could see it in his eyes. I would rather be alone than be a burden to someone." "You could never be a burden," Penelope said, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. "You are kind and hard-working and decent. Those are rare qualities." Grant looked at her across the table, and something passed between them, a connection that neither could quite name. He cleared his throat and stood, gathering the dishes. "I will help you clean up," he said. They worked together in comfortable silence, and when the kitchen was clean, they sat by the fire for a while. Grant read from a book while Penelope worked on some mending she had found in a basket. It was peaceful and domestic, and Penelope felt a pang of sadness when she remembered that this was temporary. In 2 weeks, Thomas would return, and she would have to go back to her life with him and his terrible mother. The days fell into a pleasant routine. Penelope woke early and prepared breakfast, then spent her mornings cleaning and cooking, while Grant worked with the animals and maintained the ranch. They ate lunch together, and Grant often told her stories about the cattle drives he had been on when he was younger, before he inherited the ranch. In the afternoons, Penelope would sometimes walk out to where he was working, bringing him water or coffee, and they would talk for a few minutes before he returned to his tasks. In the evenings, they shared dinner and sat by the fire, reading or talking or simply enjoying each other's company. Penelope found herself looking forward to these quiet evenings more than anything else. Grant had a way of making her feel heard and valued, something she had not felt in a long time. He asked her opinions on things, listened when she spoke, and treated her as an equal rather than a burden. On the 5th night of her stay, a storm rolled in, bringing heavy rain and thunder. Penelope stood at the window, watching the lightning illuminate the dark sky. She thought about how she would have been locked out in this weather, trying to find shelter from the rain, and she shuddered at the thought. "You are safe here," Grant said from behind her, and she turned to find him watching her with concern in his eyes. "No matter what storms come, you have shelter here." "Thank you," Penelope said. "I do not think you understand what your kindness has meant to me. I was beginning to think I did not matter to anyone, that my life had no value. You have shown me that is not true." Grant crossed the room to stand beside her at the window. "Your life has value, Penelope. Anyone who treats you otherwise is a fool." They stood together in silence, watching the storm, and Penelope became acutely aware of how close Grant was standing. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, could smell the scent of leather and hay that seemed to cling to him. When lightning flashed again, illuminating his face, she saw that he was looking at her rather than at the storm. "Penelope," he said softly, and there was something in his voice that made her heart race. "I need to tell you something." Before he could continue, a loud crash of thunder made them both jump, and the moment was broken. Grant stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "We should get some sleep," he said. "The storm will likely continue through the night." Penelope nodded, disappointed and relieved in equal measure. She had been married for 3 months, but she felt more connected to Grant after 5 days than she had ever felt to Thomas. It was confusing and frightening and exciting all at once. She retreated to her room and lay awake for a long time, listening to the rain on the roof and thinking about the cowboy in the next room. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Penelope woke to find Grant had already gone outside to check on the animals and repair any damage from the storm. She prepared breakfast and was setting the table when she heard a knock at the door. Opening it, she found herself face to face with an older woman she recognized from town, Mrs. Patterson, who ran the boarding house. "Is Grant Northwood here?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her eyes sharp as she took in Penelope's presence. "He's out in the barn," Penelope replied. "Would you like me to fetch him?" "No need," Mrs. Patterson said. "I can see he's occupied. I came to bring him some preserves, but I see he already has company. You are Thomas Lawrence's new wife, are you not?" "I am," Penelope said, lifting her chin despite the blush she could feel rising in her cheeks. "I wonder what your husband would think about you staying here," Mrs. Patterson said with false sweetness, "or what his mother would say." "His mother is the reason I am here," Penelope said firmly. "She locks me out every night in the cold. Grant Northwood was kind enough to offer me shelter when I was in danger of freezing to death. There is nothing improper happening here." "Of course not," Mrs. Patterson said, but her tone suggested she did not believe it. "Well, I will just leave these preserves on the porch. Do give Grant my regards." She left quickly, and Penelope knew the woman would spread the news all over town within hours. She felt a mixture of anger and fear, angry that people would judge without knowing the truth, but fearful that this would cause problems for Grant. When he came in for breakfast, she told him about the visit. "Let her talk," Grant said, his expression hardening. "I have done nothing wrong, and neither have you. If people want to create scandal where there is none, that is their problem." "But it could hurt your reputation," Penelope protested. "The ranch, your business relationships." "My reputation is built on my work and my word, not on gossip," Grant said. "Anyone who knows me will know the truth, and anyone who does not know me well enough to give me the benefit of the doubt is not someone whose opinion I value." Despite his reassuring words, Penelope felt uneasy for the rest of the day. She did not want to cause trouble for the man who had been so kind to her. That evening, as they sat by the fire, she brought it up again. "Perhaps I should leave her," she said. "I could find somewhere else to stay, somewhere that would not cause you problems." "Where would you go?" Grant asked. "Back to sleeping in barns? Back to being locked out in the cold?" "I will not allow it, Penelope. You are staying here until your husband returns, and that is final." "You are very stubborn," Penelope said, but she smiled as she said it. "I have been told that before," Grant replied, and he smiled too. "But my stubbornness has served me well in life. I am not about to change now." The conversation shifted to other topics, but Penelope could not shake the feeling that their time together was becoming more complicated. She was married, even if her marriage was proving to be a mistake. And yet, she found herself thinking about Grant constantly, noticing small things about him that made her heart flutter. The way he pushed his hair back when he was concentrating, the rare smiles that lit up his serious face, the gentleness in his strong hands when he tended to an injured animal. She tried to push these thoughts away, reminding herself that she had made vows, that she owed loyalty to Thomas even if his mother was cruel. But it was becoming harder to remember why she had married Thomas in the first place. He had been charming during their courtship, but she realized now that she had never really known him. She'd been lonely after her aunt passed away, desperate for security and family, and she had jumped at the first offer of marriage. The days continued to pass, and despite her worries about gossip, life at the ranch remained peaceful. Grant took her into town one day to buy supplies, and she felt the stares of the townspeople as they walked together. Some looked disapproving, while others seemed merely curious. Grant ignored them all, conducting his business with his usual efficiency. As they were leaving the general store, they encountered Thomas's mother, Margaret Lawrence. The older woman's face turned red with anger when she saw Penelope. "So this is where you have been hiding," Margaret spat. living in sin with this cowboy while your husband works to provide for you. I have been staying here because you locked me out in the freezing cold, Penelope said, her own anger rising. You left me to die, and Grant Northwood saved my life. There's nothing sinful happening. I work for my keep, and he has been nothing but respectful. A likely story, Margaret sneered. Wait until Thomas hears about this. He will have this marriage annulled, and you will be left with nothing. If Thomas cares to hear the truth, he knows where to find me, Penelope said. But I suspect you will twist everything to suit your narrative, just as you have twisted everything else. Grant stepped forward, placing himself slightly between Penelope and Margaret. Mrs. Lawrence, you should be ashamed of yourself. Your actions could have killed your son's wife. If you have a problem with my offering her shelter, you can take it up with me, but I warn you, I will not stand by and let you spread lies about either of us. Margaret looked like she wanted to say more, but something in Grant's steady gaze made her think better of it. She turned on her heel and stormed off, muttering under her breath. Penelope felt herself shaking, and Grant gently took her elbow, guiding her toward the wagon. Are you all right? He asked once they were seated and moving away from town. I think so, Penelope said. I just hate confrontation, and I know she will make things difficult when Thomas returns. Let her try, Grant said. The truth is on your side. You have done nothing wrong. They rode in silence for a while, and Penelope found herself studying Grant's profile as he drove the wagon. He had such strength in him, not just physical strength, but a moral strength that she admired deeply. She realized with a jolt that she was falling in love with him. The thought should have terrified her, but instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. That evening, after dinner, they sat by the fire as usual. Grant seemed restless, standing up to poke at the logs, then sitting down again, then standing once more. Finally, he turned to face her, his expression serious. Penelope, I need to say something, and I need you to hear me out before you respond. She set down her sewing, giving him her full attention. Her heart was pounding, and she had a feeling she knew what he was about to say. These past days with you here have been the happiest I have known in years, Grant began. You have brought light and warmth to this house, and not just because you cook and clean. You have brought joy to my life in a way I never expected. I know you are married, and I know I have no right to feel this way, but I cannot keep lying to myself or to you. I have fallen in love with you, Penelope. The words hung in the air between them, and Penelope felt tears spring to her eyes. She stood crossing the small distance between them and took his hands in hers. I have fallen in love with you too, she whispered. I have tried to deny it, tried to remember my vows, but the truth is that I never loved Thomas. I married him for security, for family, because I was alone and frightened. But what I feel for you is real, in a way my marriage never was. Grant pulled her closer, and she went willingly, resting her head against his chest. She could hear his heart beating rapidly, matching the pace of her own. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other, neither willing to break the spell. What are we going to do? Penelope asked finally. Thomas will be back in a week. I do not know, Grant admitted, but I know I cannot let you go back to that house, back to a woman who would let you freeze, and I know I cannot pretend I do not love you. I will ask Thomas for a divorce, Penelope said, the decision forming even as she spoke. It will cause scandal, but I cannot live a lie. I cannot be married to one man while loving another. It would not be fair to anyone. A divorce will not be easy to obtain, Grant warned, and people will judge you harshly for it. I know, Penelope said, but I would rather face judgment and be happy than live a comfortable lie. I have spent too much of my life being afraid, letting other people dictate my choices. I want to choose my own path, even if it is difficult. Grant cupped her face in his hands, looking into her eyes with such tenderness that it made her breath catch. You are the bravest woman I have ever known, he said softly. Then he leaned down and kissed her. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, but it quickly deepened as years of loneliness and longing poured out from both of them. Penelope wrapped her arms around Grant's neck, losing herself in the sensation of being held and cherished. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless. I have never been kissed like that, Penelope said, touching her lips in wonder. Neither have I, Grant said, and he smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed his face. I think I could spend the rest of my life kissing you and never grow tired of it." They spent the rest of the evening talking about the future, about what they would do when Thomas returned. Grant made it clear that he would stand by her no matter what happened, that he would help her navigate the complicated process of ending her marriage. Penelope felt a weight lift from her shoulders, knowing she was not alone in this. That night, as she lay in her bed, she thought about the strange path that had led her to this point. If Margaret Lawrence had not locked her out, if she had not stumbled upon Grant's barn, she might never have discovered what real love felt like. In a strange way, she was grateful for the cruelty that had brought her here, even though she would never wish such suffering on anyone else. The next few days passed in a blur of happiness, tinged with anxiety. Penelope and Grant were careful not to do anything improper, but they allowed themselves small moments of affection, a touch of hands when they passed each other, stolen kisses in the barn when Grant was doing his chores, long conversations by the fire where they shared their dreams and fears. Grant told her about his plans for the ranch, how he wanted to expand the herd and perhaps start breeding horses as well. Penelope told him about her dream of having her own dress shop one day, a place where women could come for beautiful, well-made clothing. They talked about traveling, about seeing the ocean, about all the possibilities that might lie ahead if they could build a life together. On the 12th day of Penelope's stay at the ranch, a rider came with news that Thomas Lawrence had returned from the mines a few days early. Penelope felt her stomach drop, knowing that the confrontation she had been dreading was now imminent. Grant saw the fear in her eyes and took her hand. "I will go with you," he said. "You will not face this alone." They rode into town together, and Penelope could feel the eyes of the townspeople on them as they made their way to Margaret's house. When they arrived, Thomas was standing on the porch, his face dark with anger. He was a shorter man than Grant, stocky and ruddy-faced, and he looked like he had not bathed since leaving the mines. "So it is true," Thomas said as they dismounted. "My wife has been living with another man while I was away working to provide for her." "Your wife has been staying with me because your mother locked her out every night in the middle of winter," Grant said, his voice steady and firm. "I offered her shelter when she was in danger of freezing to death. If you have a problem with that, perhaps you should ask yourself why your wife needed to seek help from a stranger in the first place." "My mother said she locked her out because Penelope was lazy and disrespectful," Thomas said. "She said Penelope refused to do her share of the work." "That's a lie," Penelope said, finding her voice. "I worked from dawn until dusk every day, cooking and cleaning and doing everything your mother asked of me. She locked me out because she hates me, because she resents me for marrying you. Ask anyone in town how thin I have become, how I looked like I was starving. Your mother gave me no supper before locking me out each night." Thomas looked uncertain now, glancing between Penelope and the door where his mother surely lurked. "Mother said you were ungrateful, that you complained constantly." "I never complained," Penelope said. "I tried to be a good wife and a good daughter-in-law, but I cannot live like that anymore, Thomas. I want a divorce." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Thomas's face turned red, and he stepped forward aggressively. Grant moved quickly, placing himself between Thomas and Penelope. "You hurt her," Grant said quietly. "She wants to end the marriage. I suggest you respect her wishes." "And I suppose she wants to marry you instead," Thomas spat. "This is what happens when a man tries to marry above his station. I should have known better than to take on some orphaned seamstress with no family." "That is enough," Grant said, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. "You will not speak to her that way." Margaret Lawrence came out onto the porch at that moment, her face twisted with malicious glee. "I told you she was no good, Thomas. I told you she would bring shame to this family. Divorce? She will be ruined. No decent person will associate with her." "I would rather be ruined and free than respected and miserable," Penelope said, and she was surprised by the strength in her own voice. "I am filing for divorce, Thomas, on the grounds of abandonment and failure to protect me from abuse. If you contest it, I will tell everyone in town exactly what your mother did to me. I have witnesses who saw me looking for shelter, who saw how thin and cold I was." Thomas looked uncertain, clearly not having expected his wife to stand up to him this way. He had known Penelope as a quiet, compliant woman, and this new assertiveness threw him off balance. His mother, however, was not ready to back down. "You have no proof of anything," Margaret said. "It will be our word against yours." Actually, she has my word as well, said a new voice, and they all turned to see Mrs. Chen from the general store approaching. I saw Penelope multiple times looking cold and hungry, and when Grant came to buy her warm clothes, he told me the situation. I believe her, and I'm willing to testify to what I saw. As am I, said another voice, and Penelope was shocked to see the minister, Reverend Hall, stepping forward. I found Penelope sleeping under the church steps one night. When I asked her why she was not at home, she was too ashamed to tell me. Now I understand why. What you did, Mrs. Lawrence, was cruel and unchristian. I support Penelope's decision to end this marriage. More people began to gather, and Penelope realized that her suffering had not gone as unnoticed as she had thought. Several townspeople stepped forward to voice their support, sharing stories of seeing her looking desperate and frightened. Thomas's face grew paler as he realized that the truth was not on his side. Fine, he said finally. If you want a divorce, you can have one. I should never have married you in the first place. You were nothing but trouble from the start. Penelope felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had expected more of a fight, but it seemed Thomas's pride was not strong enough to withstand public scrutiny. Grant put his hand on her shoulder, a gesture of support and comfort. The process of obtaining a divorce took several months, as these things did in 1878 California. Penelope continued to stay at Grant's ranch, and now that her intentions were public, she felt less guilty about her growing love for him. They were still careful to maintain propriety, knowing that any hint of impropriety could be used against her in the divorce proceedings. During this time, Penelope helped Grant with the ranch in earnest, learning about the cattle and horses, helping with the books and correspondence. She also began taking in sewing work from town, rebuilding her reputation as a skilled seamstress. Grant supported her dreams of eventually opening a dress shop, and they talked often about what their future might look like together. The divorce was finalized on a cold day in March. Penelope stood before the judge, listening as her marriage to Thomas Lawrence was officially dissolved. Thomas did not contest the divorce in the end, perhaps influenced by his mother's desire to be rid of Penelope. When it was over, Penelope walked out of the courthouse a free woman, her eyes bright with tears of relief. Grant was waiting for her outside, and when he saw her face, he knew immediately that it was done. He swept her up in his arms, spinning her around, not caring who saw. When he set her down, he dropped to one knee right there on the courthouse steps. Penelope Lawrence, or I suppose I should say Penelope Lyons again, you are the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Penelope looked down at him, at this man who had saved her life in more ways than one, and she felt her heart swell with love. Yes, she said, her voice clear and certain. Yes, I will marry you. They were married a month later in a simple ceremony at the church, with Reverend Hall officiating. Mrs. Chen and several other townspeople attended, showing their support for the couple. Penelope wore a dress she had made herself, a beautiful cream-colored gown with delicate embroidery. Grant wore his best suit, and when he saw her walking toward him down the aisle, his eyes filled with tears. "You are stunning," he whispered when she reached his side. "You are not so bad yourself," she replied with a smile. They spoke their vows with sincerity and joy, promising to love and cherish each other for the rest of their lives. When Grant kissed her as his wife, Penelope felt a happiness so complete it almost frightened her. She had not known such joy was possible. The wedding celebration was small but heartfelt, held at the ranch with food and music and laughter. As the sun set and their guests began to depart, Grant took Penelope's hand and led her away from the crowd. They walked to the barn, the place where their story had begun. "Do you remember the first time I saw you?" Grant asked. "You were curled up in the hay, looking so cold and frightened. I thought you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, even then." "I was terrified when you found me," Penelope admitted. "I thought you would throw me out, maybe even have me arrested for trespassing. I never imagined you would become my savior, my friend, and now my husband." "You saved me too," Grant said softly. "I was so lonely before you came. I'd resigned myself to a solitary life, convinced that was all I deserved. But you showed me that I could have more, that I could have everything." They kissed there in the barn, surrounded by the soft sounds of the horses and the smell of hay. And Penelope thought about how far she had come from that desperate night in the winter. She had been lost then, freezing and hopeless, but now she was found. Now she was home. Their first year of marriage was filled with hard work and happiness. Penelope's sewing business grew, and she saved every penny toward her dream of opening a shop. Grant's ranch prospered, the cattle herd expanding and bringing in good profit. They worked together on everything, true partners in every sense of the word. In the spring of 1879, Penelope discovered she was pregnant. She told Grant one evening after dinner, watching nervously for his reaction. He stared at her for a moment in shock, and then a huge grin spread across his face. "A baby," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "We are going to have a baby." "We are," Penelope confirmed, and Grant let out a whoop of joy that startled the horses in the barn. He picked her up carefully, spinning her once before setting her down gently, as if she might break. "I'm going to be a father," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "I never thought I would have a family of my own." "You're going to be a wonderful father," Penelope said, touching his face tenderly. "Our child is lucky to have you." The pregnancy was not easy. Penelope suffered from severe morning sickness in the beginning, and Grant fussed over her constantly, worried about her health. She found his concern endearing, even when it became a bit overbearing. As her belly grew, she had to stop taking in as much sewing work, but Grant assured her that they had enough money and she should focus on staying healthy. On a cold January morning in 1880, almost exactly 2 years after Grant had first found her in his barn, Penelope gave birth to a son. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Grant feared he might lose her. But Penelope was strong, and when the baby's cry finally filled the room, Grant wept with relief and joy. They named him Gabriel Northwood, and he had his father's dark hair and his mother's delicate features. Grant held his son with wonder, this tiny, perfect being that he and Penelope had created together. He thought about his own father, about the bitterness and regret that had consumed the man, and he vowed to be different. He would be the kind of father who showed love openly, who was present and engaged, who built his son up rather than tearing him down. Penelope recovered slowly from the birth, but she glowed with happiness whenever she held Gabriel. She had never imagined she could love another person as much as she loved Grant, but the love she felt for their son was equally powerful, different, but just as profound. Life settled into a new rhythm with a baby in the house. Penelope juggled caring for Gabriel with maintaining the household and doing some sewing work when she could. Grant helped as much as possible, often walking the floor with Gabriel in the evenings when the baby was fussy, singing old cowboy songs in his deep voice until Gabriel fell asleep. One evening, when Gabriel was about 6 months old, Penelope and Grant sat on the porch watching the sunset. Gabriel was sleeping peacefully in a cradle beside them, and the ranch was quiet except for the occasional lowing of cattle. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Grant asked. "When I found you in the barn?" "I think about it often," Penelope admitted. "It was the worst night of my life and the beginning of the best part of my life, all at once. Everything changed that night." "I am glad you chose my barn," Grant said with a smile. "Of all the barns in California, I am glad it was mine." "So am I," Penelope said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I would not change a single thing about our story, even the hard parts. They led us here, to this moment, to this life we have built together." Gabriel stirred in his cradle, making small noises but not quite waking. Grant reached over and rocked the cradle gently, a motion that had become second nature to him. Penelope watched him, her heart full of love for this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. The years continued to pass in happiness and prosperity. Penelope finally opened her dress shop in town when Gabriel was 3 years old, a small but elegant establishment that quickly became popular with the women of San Jose. Grant continued to build the ranch, eventually hiring a few hands to help with the work as the operation grew larger. They had 2 more children, daughters named Grace and Violet, born in 1882 and 1884, respectively. The house that had once been so quiet and lonely was now filled with laughter and noise and love. Grant proved to be as wonderful a father as Penelope had known he would be, patient and kind, and always ready with a hug or a word of encouragement. Penelope occasionally heard news of Thomas and Margaret Lawrence. Thomas had remarried a few years after their divorce, choosing a woman his mother approved of. Penelope felt no jealousy, only hoped that Thomas had learned from his mistakes and was treating his new wife better. Margaret passed away in 1885, and Penelope felt a complicated mix of emotions at the news. She could not mourn the woman who had been so cruel to her, but she felt sadness for the bitterness and hatred that had consumed Margaret's life. On a warm summer evening in 1889, Penelope and Grant celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary. Their children were playing in the yard, Gabriel, now a sturdy boy of 9, Grace, a spirited 7-year-old, and Violet, a sweet-natured 5-year-old. The ranch was thriving, Penelope's dress shop was successful, and they had built a life beyond anything either of them had imagined possible. 10 years, Grant said, pulling Penelope close as they watched their children play. It seems like both a lifetime and no time at all. I know what you mean, Penelope said. Sometimes I still cannot believe this is my life, that I have you and the children and everything we have built together. It feels like a dream. If it is a dream, I never want to wake up, Grant said, kissing the top of her head. You are everything to me, Penelope. You and the children are my whole world. And you are ours, Penelope said, turning to kiss him properly. You saved me, Grant Northwood. You saved my life that winter night, but you also saved my heart and my soul. You showed me what love really means. You saved me too, Grant insisted. I was just existing before you came along. You taught me how to truly live, how to open my heart and let someone in. We saved each other. Gabriel came running up to them, followed by his sisters. Papa, will you tell us the story again? He asked breathlessly. About how you found Mama in the barn? It had become a favorite family story, one the children never tired of hearing. Grant settled onto the porch steps, pulling Violet onto his lap, while Gabriel and Grace sat beside him. Penelope sat behind them, listening as Grant told the tale once more. It was a cold winter night, the coldest I could remember, Grant began. I went out to the barn early in the morning to feed the horses, and I saw something unusual in the hayloft. When I climbed up to investigate, I found the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, sleeping in the hay. Was Mama scared? Grace asked, even though she knew the answer. She was very scared, Grant confirmed, but she was also very brave. She told me the truth about what had happened to her, even though it was hard, and I knew right then that I had to help her. Because you are a hero, Violet said confidently, and Grant laughed. I am no hero, he said. I just did what any decent person would do. I offered shelter to someone who needed it, but I got something wonderful in return. I got a family. Penelope felt tears prick her eyes as she listened. She thought about that terrified young woman she had been, freezing and alone, certain that her life was over. She thought about the kind cowboy who had offered her not just shelter, but friendship, respect, and eventually love. She thought about the journey they had taken together, from that first frightened meeting to this moment, surrounded by the children they had created and the life they had built. As the sun set over the ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Penelope looked at her family and felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had been locked out in the cold, left to die by someone who should have cared for her, but that cruelty had led her to Grant, to love, to a life richer and fuller than she had ever imagined possible. The children eventually went inside to get ready for bed, and Grant and Penelope remained on the porch, holding hands and watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The barn stood in the distance, solid and unchanging, a silent witness to the beginning of their story. Do you think we will tell that story when we are old and gray? Penelope asked. When our children are grown and have families of their own? I think we will tell it until our last breath, Grant said. It is our story, the story of how we found each other against all odds. It is a story worth telling. It is a story worth living, Penelope corrected gently, and I am so grateful that I get to live it with you. They sat together in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other in the darkest moment and had built a life filled with light. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of hay and horses and home. Inside, their children were settling down for the night, safe and warm and loved. And on the porch, a cowboy and his wife held each other close, grateful for every moment they had been given. Gabriel grew into a fine young man, taking over more responsibilities on the ranch as he got older. He had his father's work ethic and his mother's compassion, and Grant and Penelope were endlessly proud of him. Grace inherited her mother's talent for sewing and eventually took over the dress shop, expanding it into one of the most successful businesses in San Jose. Violet became a teacher, dedicating her life to educating the children of their growing town. As the years passed, Grant and Penelope grew old together, their love deepening with each passing season. They faced challenges, as all couples do. There were hard winters and dry summers that threatened the ranch. There were illnesses and injuries, and the normal struggles of raising children. But through it all, they faced everything together, supporting each other with the same devotion they had shown from the beginning. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1909, their children threw them a grand celebration. Gabriel had married a lovely woman named Catherine, and they had given Grant and Penelope 3 grandchildren. Grace had married a banker from San Francisco, and Violet was courting a young lawyer. The house was filled with family and friends, and as Grant looked around at all the people whose lives they had touched, he felt overwhelmed with gratitude. 30 years, he said to Penelope as they danced together, his movement slower now but still steady. 3 decades since I found you in my barn. Best decision you ever made letting me stay, Penelope teased, her eyes still bright despite the lines that now marked her face. It was not even a decision, Grant said seriously. From the moment I saw you, I knew you were meant to be part of my life. I just did not know how big a part you would become. Everything, Penelope said softly. We became everything to each other. Yes, Grant agreed. Everything. They danced until the music stopped, and then they stood together on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset just as they had done thousands of times before. The barn stood in the distance, older now but still strong, still standing as a monument to the beginning of their love story. I love you, Grant said, as he had said countless times over the years. I love you too, Penelope replied, as she always did. Always and forever. They lived many more years together, growing old in the home they had built, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren. Their love story became a legend in San Jose, the tale of the cowboy who found a woman in his barn and gave her not just shelter, but a life filled with love and purpose. When Grant passed away in 1922 at the age of 70, Penelope mourned him deeply but without regret. They had had 43 years together, 43 years of love and laughter and building a life that mattered. She lived 3 more years, spending her time with her family and keeping Grant's memory alive through stories and remembrances. When Penelope died peacefully in her sleep in 1925, she was buried beside Grant in the cemetery overlooking the ranch. Their children placed a simple headstone that read, Grant and Penelope Northwood, 2 souls who found each other in the cold and built a life in the warmth of love. The ranch continued to operate, passed down through Gabriel's family. The barn where Grant had first found Penelope remained standing for many decades, eventually becoming a historical landmark. Tour guides would tell the story of the winter night in 1878 when a cowboy found a desperate woman sleeping in his hay, and how that chance meeting led to one of the great love stories of the Old West. Years became decades, and decades became a century. But the story endured. It endured because it was true, because it spoke to something fundamental about human kindness and the power of love to transform lives. It endured because Grant and Penelope had lived their story fully, never taking for granted the gift they had been given in finding each other. Their great-great-grandchildren still live in California, carrying on the legacy of hard work, compassion, and dedication to family that Grant and Penelope established. The dress shop Grace founded still operates under different ownership, and the Northwood Ranch, though much changed, still raises cattle on the land Grant once worked. And sometimes, on cold winter nights when the wind blows through the valley, locals say you can almost see 2 figures standing on the porch of the old ranch house, holding hands and watching the stars. They say it is Grant and Penelope, still together, even in death, still grateful for the night the winter cold brought them together, and the warmth of love that sustained them through a lifetime. The story of the mother-in-law who locked her daughter-in-law out every winter night, and the cowboy who found her sleeping in his barn, became more than just a story. It became a testament to the idea that even in our darkest moments, salvation can come from unexpected places. That kindness can change lives. That love, real love, is worth fighting for, no matter the cost or the scandal or the judgment of others. Penelope had started that journey as a frightened young woman with nowhere to turn, locked out in the cold by cruelty and indifference. She had ended it as a beloved matriarch, surrounded by the family she and Grant had created together, secure in the knowledge that she had lived a life of purpose and meaning. And it had all begun on a winter night in 1878, when a cowboy climbed into his hayloft and found more than just a trespasser. He found his future, his partner, his everything. Their love story proved that the Old West was not just about gunslingers and cattle drives and frontier justice. It was also about ordinary people finding extraordinary love in the midst of hardship. It was about choosing compassion over cruelty, love over loneliness, hope over despair. Grant and Penelope chose each other, and in doing so, they created a legacy that outlived them both. The barn where it all began eventually fell into disrepair and had to be torn down in the 1950s, but before it was demolished, the family salvaged some of the wood from the hayloft where Penelope had slept that fateful night. They used it to build a bench that still sits on the porch of the ranch house, a physical reminder of where their family story began. Generations of Northwood children have sat on that bench listening to the story of their great-great-grandparents, learning about courage and kindness and the transformative power of love. And so the story lives on, passed down through the years. A reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead to the best chapters, that sometimes being locked out in the cold is the beginning of finding warmth we never knew existed, that sometimes a stranger becomes a savior, and a barn becomes a sanctuary, and a chance encounter becomes a love that lasts beyond death itself. Grant and Penelope's story reminds us all that love is worth the risk, that kindness matters, and that even on the coldest winter night, hope can be found sleeping in a barn, waiting to be discovered by someone brave enough to climb the ladder and offer help to a stranger in need.